They live within the long reach of ice. During the last glacial maximum, when the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets press outward and mountains bear their own caps of cold global sea level, stands roughly 120 meters lower than today, and continental shelves lie exposed as broad, wind-swept plains. Coastlines extend far from their modern margins. Estuaries deepen into valleys. River mouths cut farther across the shelf before meeting the sea. In this landscape, humans move along new corridors that did not exist in warmer times, and old routes contract or vanish beneath ice and permafrost. The Mammoth Steppe, a continuous belt of cold grassland, stretches across much of the northern hemisphere, linking regions that are today separated by forests, mountains, and seas. In the far northwest of Eurasia and the northeast of Asia, the land between continents rises. Beringia is not a narrow isthmus, but a wide country at times, more than 1,000 kilometers across, with low hills, braided rivers, and herds that graze across dry ground where the Bering Strait will later return. People camp on river terraces and slopes above floodplains using simple hearths and stone tools suited to wood, bone, and ice, and they look out upon distances that are not broken by water. Far away in what will become Southeast Asia, a different shelf is exposed. Sunderland extends the fringes of the continent and the islands of Sumatra. Borneo and Java draw closer to the mainland, though deep channels still mark passages that never fully dry. In the North Atlantic, the land that will one day be the North Sea is dry ground. Doggerland, crisscrossed by rivers that gather the waters of the Thames, the Rhine, and the Scheldt into a single trunk flowing to the ocean. This is a time when maps would look unfamiliar. The Persian Gulf is largely a plain laced by the down-cut courses of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun. The Channel is a valley. Shelves become fields and hunting grounds. These exposures matter because they reconfigure how groups meet, share materials, and carry ideas. When sea retreats, the coasts are farther out, and human settlements that hug shorelines lie on ground that later drowns. Much of the record of early movement and exchange along those coasts is now submerged, leaving an absence that archaeologists perceive in gaps of evidence. People follow rivers because water is predictable and frozen ground channels movement. The Danube and Dniester, the Don and Volga, the Ob and Yenisei, the Lena and Kolyma. The Yukon and Mackenzie, these and many others, function as long corridors linking resource patches. In summer, they are highways by canoe or skin boat. In winter, their frozen surfaces become steady routes for foot travel and sledges. Camps appear where river and ridge meet, where wood game and stone are close enough to support repeated visits. The fact that sea level is so low is not merely a number. It changes windstorms and rainfall. With more water locked as ice pressure patterns shift, monsoon belts migrate and deserts expand or contract according to latitude and season. Dust storms strengthen over drying basins, and the signal of that dust settles in ice cores far away, a planetary register that mirrors the redistribution of moisture and the vigor of wind. Across this altered climate, humans carry materials that resist decay, stone, bone, ivory, as well as pigments that bind to rock and skin. Some carry raw nodules of high-quality tools toned from exposures they know well. Others move finished blades, points, and cores from camp to camp. They also carry stories about where to find them. Over time, paths of movement, seasonal meetings, and marriages stitch distant groups into webs of knowledge. A lesser-known detail sits beneath the waves of the modern North Sea trawlers, sometimes bring up peat bone and worked flint from Doggerland's drowned plains, hints of camps and hunting grounds that connected Britain to the continent before the sea returned. Far to the south and east, another lowland. The floor of the Persian Gulf likely hosted braided rivers, marshlands, and fresh water springs during cold phases, a setting some researchers propose as a refuge for people who later spread along its reflooded shores. These observations are plausible because the shelf gradients there are gentle. When oceans fall by more than 100 meters, shorelines can shift by tens to hundreds of kilometers. Still, even as patterns emerge, mysteries remain. Archaeologists can trace the direction of movement for some materials because geology leaves fingerprints. Certain volcanic glasses are chemically distinct. Some cherts and flints have recognizable fossils or inclusions. Some ochres carry rare element signatures. Yet, submerged coasts hide the oldest harbors, and cave occupations reflect only those who happen to use caves. How far exchange reaches during the coldest millennia is uncertain, and whether most movement rests on direct journeys or down-the-line transfers passing materials from neighbor to neighbor varies by region and time. The balance between local mobility and long-distance links cannot be generalized. It depends on river geometry, game migrations, ice margins, and storms. The Ice Age does not create a single network. It creates conditions that encourage many networks to form, fragment, and reform as climates oscillate. In Eurasia's mid-latitudes, loess fields accumulate, creating deep soils that later nourish grasslands. In the present moment, they are open, windy spaces with thin stands of steppe shrubs and scattered birch. Firelight in winter camps is steady, fueled by driftwood pulled from river edges or brush gathered along gullies. Stars are bright where air is dry and cold, helpful for orientation on the plains, but groups mostly follow landmarks. They know the line of a ridge, the bend of a river, a stand of tall pines that survived wind throw. Ice sheets serve both as walls and guides. At their margins, meltwater feeds wetlands, where waterfowl gather and fish are trapped in oxbows. Along their edges, people return seasonally to exploit predictable resources and to meet other bands. In these places, gifting and exchange become social tools. A small blade of fine stone offered at a meeting may later return as a reciprocated favor, and a memory of where it came from travels with the object. The scale of these spaces is large. Thuringia's width, the reach of the Danube corridor, the spread of the northern grasslands from Western Europe to the Yenisei and onward to Alaska, all measure in thousands of kilometers. Moving through them does not require a single journey. It requires repeated steps through years, guided by knowledge exchanged at seasonal gatherings and by the steady cues of rivers and animals. The world is cold, but it is not uniformly harsh. Refugia exist in river valleys, on south-facing slopes and near springs that do not freeze. People adjust their technology accordingly. Insulated clothing stitched from hides and sinew-bone needles and awls, composite points that can be repaired and replaced, and containers to carry fuel and food as they traverse between camps. Camps are organized for reliability more than appearance, hearths in shallow pits to block wind, sleeping areas shielded by hides, toolkits arranged where the work is done. Over time, as seas rise and fall with stadials and interstadials, the same place alternates between inland terrace and coastal bluff. The record we see today is a partial cross-section through that chain shaped by taphonomy and flooded coastlines. Yet the outline is clear. The geometry of ice, sea, and shelf refashions the map, and humans respond by moving along the routes that best preserve water, fuel, and stone. In doing so, they carry more than materials. They carry information about distant exposures, better sources of ochre, and safer crossings. This is how horizons expand under ice, not in leaps, but in steady circulation that turns corridors into connections. As the section closes on this vantage, the future network is already implied. When ice retreats and water returns, many of these corridors will drown. But the habits of meeting, exchanging, and remembering routes do not drown with them. They persist as practice. In the next passages, traces of that practice, stones, shells, pigments, and ivory, will mark the pathways across which people travel and keep traveling while the planet continues its slow rebalancing. Stone is more than a tool. It is a signal of distance and contact. In the Ice Age world, high-quality stone suitable for napping into blades, scrapers, and points is not evenly distributed. Some exposures lie near volcanic ridges, others in chalk cliffs or river gravels, and each source has its own color, texture, and fracture quality. Archaeologists recognize them by their mineral signatures, and when these appear far from their origin, they testify to movement across landscapes. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its sharp edge, is one of the most striking examples. In Anatolia, the highlands host obsidian flows that solidified millennia before. Blades made from that glass are found hundreds of kilometers away in camps and shelters. To the trained eye, each nodule carries the imprint of its birthplace, and through geochemical analysis, modern science can trace how a single flake traveled across valleys, through passes, and into the toolkit of people who never saw the eruption that formed it. This distribution suggests that long before farming, people knew where to find such sources, and they knew others who lived nearer to them. Exchanges could occur at seasonal gatherings, in river crossings, or at hunting rendezvous. Whether through direct journeys or stepwise transfers, the stone moves outward, a tangible thread linking groups separated by distance. Flint serves a similar role in Ice Age Europe. Deposits in the chalk of northern France and southern Britain provide abundant raw material, yet flint blades and cores from those regions appear deep inland. The sharpness and predictability of flint make it valuable, and its presence outside its geological home tells of corridors of contact. In the eastern plains, chert nodules are carried far into the steppe, worked into points suited for hunting reindeer and bison. In each case, the stone is more than functional. It is a medium of connection, proof that groups interacted beyond the limits of their own territories. A lesser-known detail comes from the highlands of Armenia and Georgia, where obsidian sources are dense and varied. In the caves of the southern Caucasus, people during the Upper Paleolithic used obsidian from multiple distinct flows, some more than 100 kilometers apart. This pattern indicates not random gathering, but deliberate knowledge of distant outcrops and their properties, suggesting a cultural map of stone sources that extended across mountains and valleys. Carrying obsidian is not light. Nodules are heavy and brittle. The fact that people invested in transporting them or in obtaining them through exchange reflects both utility and social value. To present a blade of distant stone might be to display a connection, an affirmation that one belongs to a wider network of movement. Yet, mystery remains. Do these long distances reflect direct travel with groups ranging widely across hundreds of kilometers, or do they reflect chains of down-the-line transfer, where each group exchanges some of what it carries with its neighbors? Archaeologists debate the balance of these mechanisms. In some regions where large quantities of distant stone appear together, direct procurement seems likely. In others, where exotic pieces are rare and scattered stepwise transfer may better explain their presence. The truth may vary with time, terrain, and climate. The planetary scale reinforces the significance. While glaciers cover much of northern Europe and North America, belts of resource-rich stone exposures are left accessible at their margins, drawing groups into contact zones. Across continents, the overall effect is similar. The cold world constrains habitation to certain corridors, and in those corridors, resources converge. Stone becomes a token of how people navigate the reshaped Earth, connecting nodes on a vast, ice-framed grid. In scale, some of these movements rival modern continental journeys. Obsidian from central Anatolia, reaching camps in the Levant, represents a transfer of several hundred kilometers, a distance equal to crossing from Paris to Berlin. Flint, traveling from southern Britain across what was then dry land into continental Europe, spanned another great reach. In North America, cherts from the Great Plains have been documented far beyond their sources, moved across grasslands by hunter-gatherers who followed herds and rivers. These distances are not trivial. They represent systematic circulation. Alongside the archaeological record of stone movement, one can imagine the seasonal rhythms that facilitated it. In winter, groups might retreat to sheltered valleys where fuel and game were more reliable. In summer, they might expand onto steppes and tundra, meeting others at river junctions or near ice margins where herds gathered. At these nodes, materials could be exchanged alongside knowledge of routes, weather, and game behavior. A blade from afar is not only useful, it is evidence of distant experience. The lesser-known yet important detail is that some sources became so prominent that they likely served as regional magnets. The Krzemionki flint mines in Poland, though exploited later, illustrate how certain exposures of particularly fine stone drew repeated attention. In the Paleolithic, comparable but smaller centers existed places where high-quality stone outcrops naturally known across a wide area. Knowledge of such places spread not randomly but systematically preserved in memory and transmitted across generations. Even today, archaeologists can sometimes reconstruct these pathways by mapping artifact chemistry against geological sources, revealing the extent of those early connections. One enduring mystery is the social mechanism of exchange. Were stones traded for other goods, such as hides, ivory, or pigments, or were they exchanged more as gifts, reinforcing alliances and kinship ties? The archaeological record cannot easily distinguish economic trade from social gifting. Yet, both possibilities highlight that stone carried meanings beyond its edge. It traveled because humans lived not in isolation, but in a lattice of overlapping territories where movement and contact were essential for survival. On the planetary scale, the circulation of stone foreshadows a wider pattern. Later, as seas rose and shelves flooded, some of these networks were severed, leaving materials stranded in the archaeological record far from their sources. Yet during the Ice Age, when land routes were broad and rivers long, stones could travel astonishing distances, crossing landscapes that in today's world lie drowned beneath seas or hidden beneath forest. The rhythm of these exchanges marks the beginning of global trade in its simplest form, not markets or currencies, but the steady movement of valued materials across space. Each flake and blade is a record of a contact, a fragment of a story larger than any one group. As humans carry stone across tundra, steppe, and mountain, they unknowingly weave the first threads of networks that will one day bind continents. In their movements shaped by ice and opportunity, the seeds of future connectivity are already present. As this section closes, the stones lie scattered in sites far from home, each one a small testament to the distance it traveled and the hands it passed through. In the next view, shells will replace stone carried inland from shores unseen, marking another path by which humans in the Ice Age stitched landscapes together. Beads of shell tell another story of distance and connection. In the late Pleistocene, long before agriculture or cities, small ornaments fashioned from marine shells appear in sites far inland, in caves and open-air camps, far removed from any coast. Their presence shows that people carried or exchanged not only utilitarian tools, but also symbolic objects, objects with meanings that outlasted their immediate use. Archaeologists studying these beads note their uniform size, deliberate perforation, and where consistent with being strung together or sewn onto clothing. They are more than curiosities. They are evidence of symbolic behavior and of networks that carried fragile materials across landscapes reshaped by ice. Shells travel far. In North Africa, perforated nacreous shells are found at sites more than 100 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. In the Levant Mediterranean, shells appear deep inland, far from any direct access to coasts. In Central Asia, beads made from marine shells sometimes accompany burials many hundreds of kilometers from any sea. These distances are significant, for shell is not a heavy raw material like obsidian or flint. It is fragile, prone to breakage, and of limited practical use. Its value lies instead in what it represents: a connection to distant waters, to encounters beyond one's immediate horizon. Carrying shell beads across mountains and steppes demonstrates that humans in the Ice Age valued not only survival, but also the circulation of symbols. A lesser-known example comes from sites in eastern Africa dating to over 30,000 years ago, where small marine shells have been found far inland, suggesting that exchange systems capable of transporting delicate items across large distances were already in place. The shells are sometimes polished, sometimes modified, and they often appear in clusters as if they were once part of necklaces or sewn adornments. Their distribution implies a shared aesthetic or symbolic code, one that persisted across landscapes divided by deserts and highlands. The planetary scale deepens the observation. During the last glacial maximum, coastlines were drawn far outward. Many shell-gathering zones of the time are now submerged beneath meters of ocean, their camps and workshops lost to view. Yet even from the fragmentary record that survives, it is clear that shells moved across continents, reaching places where no living mollusk existed. This means that the first global networks were not solely about survival materials. They already included objects of adornment carrying meanings that bound groups together socially. Mystery surrounds the mechanisms by which shells moved. Did coastal groups travel inland, seasonally, bringing beads as gifts to others they encountered? Did inland groups journey outward, trading hides, bone, or flint for shells? Or did shells move down the line, passing from one group to the next, gradually shifting across the landscape? Each scenario is possible and evidence cannot yet fix on a single model. Archaeologists note that some shell types are widely distributed, suggesting systematic exchange, while others appear rarely, perhaps reflecting one-time journeys or unique connections. These questions remain open, underscoring the complexity of human interaction during the Ice Age. The scale of movement can be measured. A shell bead found in the interior Sahara represents a journey from coast to desert oases of more than 300 kilometers, a distance longer than from London to Paris. In Eurasia, marine shells transported into steppe zones traveled even farther. In the Americas, though, the archaeological record is later comparable. Patterns emerge: shells from Pacific or Gulf coasts appear inland, carried by people long before organized trade routes existed. Such distances emphasize the persistence of symbolic exchange in human life. Shells matter because they represent memory. They are tangible reminders of landscapes beyond immediate experience. For a person in an inland cave, a necklace of shell might signify kin ties to coastal groups, an ancestry traced to far horizons, or participation in rituals that linked distant camps. For archaeologists today, they represent evidence that symbolic systems did not remain confined to isolated groups, but spread across regions, bridging diverse environments. Another lesser-known detail is that wear analysis on some beads shows extended use. Shells were not simply made and discarded. They were carried restrung and repaired across generations. This endurance suggests that meaning accumulated with time. A bead could represent not only its place of origin, but also the journeys and encounters of its holders. In this way, shells become not just ornaments, but carriers of history. The planetary observation reinforces the depth of this behavior. As glaciers expanded, climates shifted, and deserts spread, humans adapted by forging networks of contact. Shell beads, though small, testify to those networks spanning entire regions. They remind us that Ice Age societies lived not in isolation, but in webs of connection extending across coast and interior, desert and river, tundra and mountain. Their presence far inland demonstrates how humans integrated distant landscapes into their symbolic worlds centuries before agriculture reshaped their economies. Yet questions remain unresolved. Why did shells hold such significance compared to other materials? Was it their rarity, their connection to water, or their sheen under firelight? Archaeologists cannot fully answer. The record shows that different species of shells were selected often carefully, implying cultural preferences and shared choices. Whether these choices reflected aesthetic taste, ritual function, or social signaling is still debated. What is certain is that their movement reveals a human pattern to connect, to exchange, to carry symbols of distant places into new contexts. The quiet endurance of these beads across millennia emphasizes that trade networks began not with markets but with relationships. Small tokens like shells crossed landscapes, linking groups separated by vast distances, helping to stabilize alliances and spread shared practices. They were among the earliest global artifacts circulating at a scale far greater than the subsistence needs of any one community. As this section closes, one can picture the inland campfires where shells glimmer in the firelight carried there from unseen shores. They are fragile, but their presence endures in the soil, telling us that in the deep cold of the Ice Age, humans still sought to carry the sea with them into the heart of the continents. In the next section, attention turns to rivers, the pathways that shaped how these materials moved, guiding journeys and exchanges across the frozen world. Rivers shape the map of Ice Age life. In a world where ice sheets expand, forests retreat, and coastlines wander outward, rivers remain as constant threads drawing lines across shifting plains. They provide water in seasons of scarcity, shelter in cut banks and terraces, and pathways through landscapes that might otherwise be impassable. During the last glacial maximum, when the climate is cold and arid across vast regions, rivers serve as arteries of both survival and exchange. Their valleys are refuges where animals gather, plants endure, and humans return again and again. Archaeologists trace this pattern in the Danube corridor, where caves and terraces preserve long sequences of human use. From Austria to Serbia, sites show occupation spanning millennia, their artifacts reflecting both local continuity and distant links. The Danube, running from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, is more than a waterway. It is a highway of ideas, tools, and genes connecting Central Europe to the steppe and beyond. In Siberia, the Lena Yenisei and Ob serve comparable roles, guiding movement across tundra and taiga. Their floodplains offer fishing waterfowl and wood, all scarce resources in cold steppes. People camp along their terraces, gathering driftwood for fire and building shelters against the wind. In North America, the Mackenzie and Yukon fulfill similar functions, channeling human movement from the interior to the Arctic coast. Everywhere in the Ice Age world, rivers serve as corridors of connection. A lesser-known detail lies in the evidence of repeated crossings at river junctions. At Kostenki, on the Don River in Russia, more than 20 sites cluster along a stretch of terrace. Excavations reveal mammoth bone dwellings, hearths, and ornaments, along with imported materials such as flint and shells. The clustering suggests not just repeated occupation, but also gatherings where groups met seasonally. Rivers, by drawing people to predictable resources, created natural meeting points where exchange could take place. The Don corridor, feeding into the larger Volga and ultimately toward the Caspian, links local groups into wider circuits of contact. Farther west in France, the Dordogne Valley preserves a chain of cave sites with rich Paleolithic art. While the art reflects symbolic life, the valley itself reveals a pattern of seasonal return where groups used rivers not only for movement but also for cultural expression. Planetary forces shape these rivers. With sea level lowered by more than 100 meters, their mouths extend far onto continental shelves. The Thames, Rhine, and Seine do not meet the sea at their modern estuaries, but continue across Doggerland's plains, merging before reaching the distant Atlantic. These submerged valleys once offered fertile soils, marshes, and fisheries, and they served as great conduits of movement across what is now the North Sea. Similarly, the Tigris and Euphrates today, emptying into the Persian Gulf, flowed across a vast plain of braided rivers and wetlands when the Gulf floor lay exposed. Humans moving along those river valleys encountered rich habitats and linked highland and lowland groups in circuits of exchange. Yet mystery remains about the scale and permanence of these connections. Did groups follow entire rivers across their lengths, or did they move within familiar stretches, relying on down-the-line contact for materials to travel farther? Archaeologists find obsidian flint and shells carried along rivers, but the precise mechanics of transfer remain debated. Seasonal flooding might disrupt settlements, leaving patchy archaeological traces, while long use of certain terraces hints at enduring knowledge of roots. The balance between local mobility and interregional contact is difficult to fix, and each river may tell a different story. On the planetary scale, rivers demonstrate how climate shapes human possibility. When ice locks up water, rainfall diminishes, yet rivers fed by glacial melt can be vigorous, cutting valleys and spreading gravels rich in toolstone. These processes create both obstacles and opportunities. Swollen summer floods hinder crossings, while winter ice provides steady surfaces for movement. Humans adapt by timing their journeys, building seasonal camps and carrying knowledge of safe fords. A subtle scale reference illustrates this: reach the Danube's course, from its source to its delta measures, nearly 2,900 kilometers, a distance comparable to crossing an entire continent. For people living along its length, this river corridor connected disparate environments: alpine headwaters, temperate valleys, steppe margins, and coastal plains into a single potential chain of exchange. Smaller rivers served as tributary networks linking interior uplands to larger arteries. In this way, rivers collectively formed a global lattice of movement mirrored in the archaeological record by the circulation of stone, ivory, and shell. A lesser-known detail is found in Central Europe, where pollen records from river sediments reveal localized refugia of trees, pines, birches, and hazels that survived in valleys while uplands froze. These stands provided not only wood but also ecological stability that drew people repeatedly. The rivers thus functioned as both highways and ecological anchors, preserving pockets of diversity in a largely treeless steppe. Their role in human survival in contact cannot be overstated. Another unresolved question concerns watercraft. While the archaeological record rarely preserves organic materials, indirect evidence suggests that Ice Age groups may have used simple boats or rafts along rivers. This would have expanded the scale of movement, allowing transport of heavy goods like mammoth ivory or obsidian. Some scholars argue that the distribution of distant stone and shell is difficult to explain without river transport. Yet proof remains elusive, hidden by the decay of wood and hide. The possibility underscores how rivers may have supported not only seasonal crossings, but also systematic trade of materials across longer distances. The planetary perspective deepens this vision. Rivers link glacial margins to sea steppes to mountains, forests to deserts. They integrate the varied environments of the Ice Age world into chains of movement. Humans, by following rivers, weave those environments into social and material networks that stretch across continents. The rivers, themselves reshaped by glacial advance and retreat, preserve sediments that today tell the story of those connections in pollen, charcoal, and stone. As this section closes, rivers stand as enduring guides in the cold world, carrying water animals and humans across plains that no longer exist. They are the moving pathways of Ice Age trade, their channels now submerged or altered, but their imprint visible in the distribution of materials far from source. In the next section, attention turns from water to the vast expanses of steppe and tundra, where humans walked highways of grass and ice, forging connections across open lands under the gaze of herds and sky. Across the Ice Age world, open grasslands and tundra serve as highways of movement, stretching from Western Europe through Siberia to Alaska. The so-called mammoth steppe covers an expanse larger than any ecosystem today. It is a mosaic of dry grasslands, scattered shrubs, and cold-adapted herbivores bound together by winds from the glaciers and the long winters of the last glacial maximum. In these open spaces, groups of humans follow herds of reindeer, bison, horses, and mammoths moving seasonally across plains where visibility is long and obstacles are few. The grasslands are not empty wastelands, but rich in resources, providing game marrow hides and bone as well as broad horizons for movement. They become the connective fabric between more fragmented environments, mountains, rivers, forests, acting as the great thoroughfares of Ice Age exchange. Archaeological evidence supports this role. In sites along the Loess plains of Central Europe, stone tools from distant sources appear in contexts where mammoth and horse bones dominate. The pattern suggests that groups who came to hunt also carried materials across great distances, either arriving with exotic stones or leaving them behind as they moved on. At Yana RHS in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, people lived nearly 32,000 years ago, crafting tools from mammoth ivory and local stone, but also possessing ornaments of distant origin. Such finds show that even in the far north, connections tied communities to wider networks. A lesser-known detail emerges from the high Arctic of modern Alaska, where microblades and core tools of Siberian design appear around 14,000 years ago. Their presence demonstrates not only population movement, but also the flow of technology across Beringia, the land that connected Asia and North America. The mammoth steppe provided the corridor that allowed such exchanges, bridging continents before seas rose to sever them. Mystery persists in understanding how far individuals or groups actually traveled. Did one band follow herds for thousands of kilometers, or did overlapping territories create chains of contact that moved goods and ideas without any one group ranging so far? The archaeological record is ambiguous. In some regions, artifact styles are strikingly uniform across vast expanses, suggesting long-range interactions or shared traditions. In others, variability indicates more localized adaptations. The balance between direct movement and cultural diffusion remains a central question. Yet, whatever the mechanism, the effect is, the same ideas, tools, and materials move with surprising breadth across the cold landscapes. Planetary forces underpin this system. The steppe exists because ice sheets lock up moisture and reduce rainfall, suppressing forests and expanding open grasslands. Winds sweep across continents, unbroken by trees carrying loess that settles in thick blankets. These processes create fertile but treeless soils, home to the great herbivores that fuel human subsistence. The ecosystem extends from Iberia to Alaska, forming one of the most continuous biomes ever known. Its scale is immense, more than 10,000 kilometers from end to end, greater than the width of the Pacific. For humans, this expanse is not a barrier, but a corridor, allowing movements that rival intercontinental distances today. Camps on the steppe are practical and durable. Hearths are dug into loess banks, their ash mixing with wind-blown dust. Bone and ivory structures provide shelter, sometimes arranged in circles of mammoth bones covered with hides. Such dwellings appear at sites like Mezhyrik in Ukraine, where entire houses built from mammoth bones reveal the capacity of Ice Age people to engineer stability in harsh environments. Within those houses, ornaments of amber and shell hint at contacts beyond the hunting grounds. Even in places defined by subsistence, symbols of distant origins endure. A lesser-known observation comes from pollen records within loess sequences, which show intermittent growth of grasses and herbs adapted to colder climates. These patches supported grazing herds in densities high enough to sustain large human populations. The productivity of the mammoth steppe made it not merely a corridor, but a living landscape where repeated gatherings and exchanges occurred. The open horizons encouraged interaction. Groups could see fires from afar, follow herd trails to shared watering places, and recognize familiar campsites across years. Mystery lies in the social dynamics of such open exchanges. Did bands encounter one another in competition for herds, or did they form alliances exchanging stone ivory and shell to cement relationships? Archaeology cannot fully resolve this. The presence of exotic materials implies at least some level of cooperation, while the spread of tool traditions suggests networks resilient enough to persist across millennia. Conflict may have occurred, but the endurance of broad cultural patterns indicates that exchange outweighed isolation. On the planetary scale, the mammoth steppe exemplifies how glacial climates reshape human geography. Where today the taiga forest blocks long east-west movement in Siberia, in the Ice Age steppe, humans could travel across Eurasia with relatively few obstacles. Herds provided predictable resources, rivers cut through plains offering water and driftwood, and open skies gave orientation by sun and stars. The corridor allowed not only genetic exchange among populations, but also the flow of symbolic traditions. Carvings of mammoth ivory, beads of distant stone, and ornaments of shell attest to ideas moving along with people and animals. A scale reference clarifies the reach of migration from Central Europe to Eastern Siberia, crossing more than 6,000 kilometers, is greater than the span from New York to Los Angeles, twice over. While few, if any, groups undertook the entire journey, the corridor made such distances functionally connected, allowing innovations and objects to spread continent-wide. Another lesser-known detail is that traces of animal dung preserved in permafrost soils indicate that herds moved seasonally along predictable paths. Humans could follow these trails year after year, creating highways of subsistence that overlapped with highways of trade. In this way, ecology structured social contact. The paths of bison and mammoth became the paths of people and their materials. Yet as climates shifted, the balance changed. During warmer interstadials, forest patches returned, fragmenting the open steppe into mosaics. Networks adapted accordingly, sometimes narrowing, sometimes shifting to new routes. The ebb and flow of ecosystems paralleled the ebb and flow of human connections, making the steppe both a stage for continuity and a witness to change. As this section draws to its close, one can picture the broad grasslands beneath a cold sky dotted with herds where small human groups move steadily carrying stone from distant quarries, ivory from mammoth hunts, and shells from coasts unseen. They walk across plains larger than modern nations, yet their paths intersect. Their exchanges ripple outward, and their symbols endure. The mammoth steppe, vast and austere, functions not as emptiness, but as the great connective tissue of the Ice Age world. In the next section, attention turns to a different signal: volcanic glass that traveled across continents, its sharp edges and chemical signatures marking one of the clearest traces of long-distance contact in deep prehistory. Volcanoes erupt rarely, yet their traces travel far. In the Ice Age, eruptions across Eurasia and beyond left behind obsidian, the volcanic glass that fractures with edges sharper than any flint. Its gleaming surfaces, black or green or mahogany, depending on trace minerals, drew the attention of early toolmakers who prized its ability to form fine blades and points. Obsidian sources are geologically restricted, often tied to specific flows or domes, and each carries a chemical signature that modern science can identify with precision. When those signatures appear hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from their origin, they testify to webs of human contact stretching across glacial landscapes. One of the clearest examples lies in Anatolia, where obsidian from central volcanoes, such as Cappadocia, appears in Paleolithic sites far to the south. Archaeologists have traced nodules and blades to sources at Göbekli Tepe and Nenezi Dağ, their composition distinct enough to map. These pieces traveled into the Levant, crossing steppe and valley-reaching camps where the local stone was of poorer quality. The distances involved, often more than 300 kilometers, indicate systematic movement or repeated down-the-line transfer. A lesser-known detail comes from the southern Caucasus, where sites like Dzudzuana Cave in Georgia contain obsidian from multiple flows, some located more than 200 kilometers apart. This variety suggests that people there maintained knowledge of several distant quarries, either through travel or through ties with groups who lived nearer to them. In carrying obsidian, they carried not only sharpness, but also the memory of where that stone was born, embedding landscapes of fire into networks of cold. Mystery surrounds the scale of such transfer. Were there groups who specialized in gathering obsidian and moving it outward, or did every group collect as much as it could when within range? Some archaeologists argue for the beginnings of specialized exchange networks, while others see only opportunistic procurement amplified by generations of contact. The evidence cannot yet decide. What is clear is that obsidian reached places far beyond any one group's seasonal territory, making it one of the earliest clear markers of long-distance circulation. On the planetary scale, obsidian reminds us of Earth's dynamism during the Ice Age. While glaciers advanced and seas withdrew, volcanoes continued to erupt, their ash spreading across skies, their lava forming domes and ridges. In some regions, such as Japan, eruptions left thick tephra layers that shaped soils and water systems. In others, the glass itself became a material that bound communities together. The contrast between ice and fire is stark, yet both shaped human possibility. Ice by sculpting corridors, volcanoes, by providing the raw material for tools that traveled far from their fiery birthplaces. The distances involved reveal scale. In eastern Africa, obsidian from the Rift Valley is found hundreds of kilometers from its volcanic sources, carried across savanna and desert alike. In Melanesia, much later obsidian moved among islands, but even in the Pleistocene, its journey inland across Eurasia already measured in hundreds of kilometers, as far as the journey from Rome to Vienna. In some cases, pieces traveled even farther, reaching sites where they must have passed through many hands. Their gleaming edges and fragility made them striking items of exchange easily recognized as foreign. Camps where obsidian occurs often contain only a few nodules or flakes, suggesting that they were valued, curated, and perhaps gifted rather than casually discarded. A lesser-known observation is that use-wear analysis shows obsidian was not always employed for heavy tasks. Sometimes it was used sparingly, even ritually, as if its value extended beyond simple cutting ability. Its sheen in firelight, or its association with distant eruptions, may have given it symbolic weight alongside practical function. Another unresolved question is whether eruptions themselves influenced human movement. Large eruptions could devastate local environments, forcing groups to relocate. Ash layers in Anatolia and the Caucasus record such events. And while humans returned after conditions stabilized, it is possible that displaced groups carried obsidian knowledge farther afield. Whether forced migration amplified the spread of obsidian is still debated. On a global scale, these transfers highlight the resilience of Ice Age networks. Even in landscapes of tundra steppe and glacial valleys, humans maintained contact over distances that rival the size of nations. Obsidian's distribution is not random. It follows river valleys, mountain passes, and steppelands that form the connective tissue of the era. By mapping these pathways, archaeologists reconstruct corridors of contact that align with ecological possibilities, places where herds gathered, where rivers joined, where passes opened into new basins. These same corridors likely carried not only obsidian, but also shells ochre and ideas. A subtle scale reference helps illustrate this reach. Obsidian from Armenian sources has been found more than 500 kilometers away, a distance equivalent to walking from Paris to Prague. For groups without domesticated animals or wheeled transport, such distances represent enormous cumulative effort made possible only through steady networks of contact and exchange. Each piece of volcanic glass found far from its source is thus a marker of human persistence in connection. Another lesser-known but telling case lies in Japan, where obsidian was quarried from underwater flows off the coast of Hokkaido during later prehistory, but even earlier sources on Honshu show evidence of distribution in the Pleistocene. This suggests that even in regions where volcanic glass was less abundant, humans sought and circulated it widely. The impulse to acquire such sharp and striking material transcended local availability, embedding volcanoes into human geographies. As the Ice Age progressed, obsidian continued to circulate. Its durability in the archaeological record allows modern researchers to track human movement with unusual precision, a clarity not often available with organic materials. Each piece is a signature, a trace of how groups navigated a world where ice and fire coexisted, where survival demanded ingenuity, and where exchange created links stronger than distance. Mystery lingers in the social meaning of these exchanges. Was obsidian traded as part of alliances sealing bonds between groups? Did its volcanic origin inspire awe or ritual use, or was it simply valued as a superior cutting edge? The answers remain elusive, but the persistence of obsidian in archaeological contexts across continents suggests that its significance was enduring, woven into both daily life and broader cultural systems. On the planetary scale, volcanic eruptions and glacial cycles remind us that Earth's surface is never static. Humans adapted not by withdrawing into isolation, but by weaving those dynamic processes into their survival strategies. The obsidian that traveled across thousands of kilometers represents not only a material advantage, but also the proof that human networks spanned continents long before cities or written records. As this section concludes, one can picture the stark contrast: a shard of glass, born in fire, carried across tundra and steppe, arriving in a cold shelter lit by a modest fire. It gleams sharp and alien, linking that small camp to a distant mountain where lava once flowed. In the next section, attention turns to another material of connection: ochre, the red earth that spread across Ice Age landscapes as symbol, memory, and mark of identity. Red earth appears wherever humans leave enduring traces. Ochre, the iron-rich pigment that yields hues from deep crimson to soft yellow, is one of the most widespread materials in Ice Age archaeology. It is found in burials, cave paintings, ornaments, and tool-making contexts across Africa, Eurasia, and Australia. Its ubiquity suggests that it carried meanings as vital as stone or ivory, though less tied to utility and more to symbol. During the last Ice Age, when glaciers carved valleys and deserts expanded, ochre traveled across regions linking communities through shared practices of marking bodies, tools, and walls. Its presence in sites far from natural sources testifies to exchange systems that valued not just survival but also symbolism. One striking example comes from southern Africa, where Middle Stone Age caves preserve ochre use extending back more than 70,000 years long before the peak of glacial cold. By the Upper Paleolithic, ochre use had spread widely. At Blombos Cave, pieces show deliberate grinding, suggesting preparation of pigment for application to skin, hides, or stone. Later in Europe's caves, ochre marks adorn walls in motifs that recur across regions, hand stencils, animal outlines, and abstract signs. These patterns imply that ochre was not only a local resource, but part of a shared symbolic repertoire that spread across groups separated by distance. A lesser-known detail lies in the discovery of ochre processing kits, grindstones, pigment pieces, and containers fashioned from shells or bones found at sites such as Abri Castanet in France or Kafze in Israel. These assemblages indicate intentional preparation and transport, implying that ochre was carried in usable form across landscapes. Its presence in burials where bodies were sprinkled with red pigment reinforces its symbolic role. From Italy to Siberia, ochre accompanies the dead, marking a continuity of ritual practice that extended across continents. Yet, mystery endures. Why red earth held such power remains debated. Some researchers propose practical uses as an insect repellent, as a hide, preservative, or as an adhesive component when mixed with resins. Others emphasize its symbolic resonance, the color of blood, fire, and life. The truth may lie in both. Its dual capacity for utility and symbolism may explain why it spread so widely and endured for so long. On a planetary scale, ochre's distribution reflects Earth's geology. Iron-rich deposits occur in soils and sediments shaped by erosion and oxidation. In glacial times, exposed landscapes revealed new veins of pigment accessible to those who knew where to look. The transport of ochre across hundreds of kilometers demonstrates how humans mapped not only food and water, but also sources of color. Its presence in caves deep within limestone hills shows that pigment was carried deliberately into symbolic spaces far beyond immediate need. The scale of its movement is striking. In Australia, ochre from the Kimberley region traveled hundreds of kilometers inland, reaching communities distant from its quarries. In Europe, sources in the Pyrenees and Alps supplied valleys far beyond their immediate reach. A scale reference helps illustrate this. Ochre blocks, weighing several kilograms, found more than 200 kilometers from their source, represent journeys longer than from Berlin to Warsaw. Transporting such weight demonstrates value not reducible to mere function. A lesser-known observation comes from residues on stone tools where microscopic traces of ochre appear on cutting edges. This suggests that pigment was sometimes applied to hides during preparation, perhaps to condition or color them. The integration of ochre into daily tasks blurs the boundary between practical and symbolic, underscoring its layered significance. Another unresolved question is whether ochre served as a shared cultural marker across regions. Did groups recognize particular hues or textures as meaningful, signaling identity or affiliation? The recurrence of red pigment in burials suggests a common thread. Yet whether it symbolized life, death, or social belonging is uncertain. Its role as one of the earliest widespread symbolic materials remains one of archaeology's enduring puzzles. On the planetary scale, ochre use highlights the breadth of Ice Age networks. From Africa to Eurasia to Australia, its presence links distant human populations in a shared tradition of marking and coloring. Unlike stone, whose utility is immediate, or shell, whose fragility requires careful transport, ochre embodies a deliberate choice to carry color across landscapes. This act implies an intention to sustain symbolic practices, even when resources were scarce, a testimony to the persistence of culture amid climatic hardship. A subtle detail reinforces this. In Siberia, at Malta near Lake Baikal, ochre is found in child burials alongside ivory ornaments and carvings. The combination suggests that pigment was not an isolated material but part of a broader system of meaning woven together with other traded and carved items. These burials, preserved under permafrost, reveal a symbolic world as rich as any later society, grounded in the exchange of both practical and symbolic goods. The planetary observation deepens further when one considers how ochre marks endure. Cave paintings in France and Spain created with ochre tens of thousands of years ago remain vivid today. Unlike organic materials that decay, ochre persists, recording networks of meaning across geological time. Its endurance is not accidental, but a consequence of its chemical stability, allowing it to carry human expression across millennia. In this way, ochre is both a material of exchange and a message from the past, a continuity that bridges Ice Age societies with the present. As this section closes, one can imagine camps where ochre is ground on flat stones, mixed with fat or water, and applied to bodies or objects. The red dust clings to skin tools and clothing, leaving traces that archaeologists still recover today. Its spread across continents, carried alongside stone, shell, and ivory, testifies to the depth of Ice Age networks, not merely economic, but symbolic, embedding meaning into movement. In the next section, attention shifts to mammoth ivory, a material born of cold steppe and tundra, carved into ornaments and figurines that traveled beyond the hunting grounds, linking caves and camps across the glacial world. Ivory, drawn from the great mammoths of the steppe and tundra, became one of the most distinctive materials of the Ice Age. Unlike stone or shell, which entered human hands through gathering or exchange, ivory came from the bodies of animals that humans hunted, scavenged, or encountered as bones weathering on plains. Its qualities, dense yet workable, pale in hue, yet able to take polish and fine incisions, made it a favored medium for carving, ornamentation, and tool-making. Across Eurasia, from the plains of Ukraine to the valleys of the Danube and the banks of Lake Baikal, mammoth ivory traveled far from the herds themselves, appearing in caves and shelters where no mammoth herds ranged. Its presence testifies to a network of movement in which ivory was not merely local refuse, but a valued resource carried across regions. Archaeologists have found elaborate ivory figurines in caves of the Swabian Jura in Germany, carved into shapes of animals and humans more than 35,000 years ago. These figurines, preserved in places far from the steppe zones where mammoths thrived, suggest that ivory was transported deliberately over great distances. Their symbolism remains mysterious, yet the act of carving itself and the endurance of the figurines across millennia speaks to the deep cultural importance of this material. A lesser-known detail lies in the distribution of ivory beads and pendants across sites in Central and Eastern Europe. Small, carefully perforated pieces of mammoth ivory appear in burials and camps far removed from hunting grounds, sometimes in contexts rich with ochre and shell beads. Their combination suggests that ivory entered the same exchange systems that moved shells from coasts and stones from quarries, serving as another thread in the web of Ice Age connectivity. In Siberia, child burials at Malta and Sungir contain ivory ornaments, numbering in the thousands, many of them painstakingly carved and polished. These assemblages show that ivory could accumulate into stores of symbolic wealth far beyond the needs of daily life. Yet mystery surrounds how consistently ivory traveled. Did hunters carry tusks themselves as portable stores of raw material, or did carved ornaments move more commonly than raw pieces? Some sites contain caches of tusk segments as if prepared for transport or trade, while others preserve only finished beads or figurines. The distinction matters, for it reveals whether exchange centered on raw resources or on crafted objects imbued with meaning. The balance between utility and symbolism remains uncertain. On the planetary scale, mammoth ivory embodies the fusion of ecology and culture. The steppe tundra supported vast herds of mammoth bison and horse, and humans exploited them for meat, hides, and bone. Ivory, however, transcended subsistence. It traveled beyond the range of the animals themselves, linking tundra hunters to valley dwellers and mountain groups. Its presence in distant caves mirrors the way seashells entered inland. Contexts, both materials represent landscapes carried into places where they did not exist. reminders of worlds beyond the immediate horizon. The scale of transport is striking. A mammoth tusk can weigh over 50 kilograms, and even sections are heavy. Yet, archaeological evidence shows that tusks were worked segmented and shaped into portable pieces, reducing their burden for long journeys. Finished beads and figurines weigh little, yet their symbolic weight was immense. A subtle scale reference emphasizes this. Ivory ornaments found in caves of Central Europe may have traveled more than 400 kilometers from the steppe zones of Eastern Europe, a distance greater than walking from Paris to Geneva. Such movement implies deliberate effort and organized transfer, not chance occurrence. A lesser-known observation arises from traces of working techniques. Archaeologists studying ivory beads at Sungir note the uniformity of drilling and polishing, suggesting standardized methods shared across communities. This indicates not only technical skill, but also communication between groups, passing on knowledge of how to transform tusks into ornaments. The spread of such techniques underscores that ivory exchange was as much about ideas as about materials. Another unresolved question is whether ivory figurines such as the lion-headed sculpture from Hohenstein-Stadel circulated beyond their places of origin. Few such objects have been found outside their caves, yet the presence of similar motifs across regions raises the possibility that carvings, or at least the ideas behind them, moved along with beads and pendants. The transmission of symbolic forms is harder to trace than the transport of raw material, yet the consistency of themes suggests deep cultural networks spanning steppe and forest. On the planetary scale, the mammoth itself became a symbol of Ice Age life. Its bones and tusks shaped dwellings, tools, and ornaments, while its image appears in cave art from France to Siberia. Carrying ivory beyond mammoth ranges meant carrying the essence of the Ice Age beast into environments where it did not roam, embedding the animal's presence into human symbolic worlds. In this sense, ivory acted not only as a material, but as a messenger of ecological identity, binding communities to the steppe even when they lived beyond it. Another lesser-known case comes from sites in China's Yellow River Basin, where ivory ornaments suggest contact with northern steppe hunters who hunted mammoth directly. These finds expand the scale of exchange networks into regions not typically associated with mammoth hunting, demonstrating that ivory traveled into diverse cultural zones. Mystery lingers over how ivory was valued compared to other materials. Was it prized more than shell or obsidian? Did it signify prestige or sacred meaning? Archaeological contexts offer hints, but no certainty. Burials with lavish ivory ornaments suggest high symbolic value, yet in other contexts, ivory pieces appear alongside utilitarian tools, implying everyday use. The duality of ivory, as both practical and symbolic, remains unresolved, reflecting the complexity of human interaction with this resource. On a planetary scale, the distribution of ivory reveals how Ice Age humans connected across ecological boundaries. Steppe hunters and valley dwellers, tundra foragers, and tile painters all participated in networks where ivory was carved, worn, and exchanged. The tusks of mammoths, born in cold plains, became beads in caves lit by firelight, hundreds of kilometers away. Their endurance in the archaeological record, polished smooth by hands, now long gone, attests to the persistence of human connection in the face of glacial cold. As this section closes, one can picture a cave deep in Europe, its walls painted with ochre, its floors scattered with shells and stone where ivory beads gleam in the firelight. They have traveled far through hands unseen, linking that cave to distant plains where mammoths grazed under the northern sky. In the next section, attention turns to mountain passes and hidden routes. The difficult corridors where people carried these materials across barriers of stone and ice-shaping networks that spanned not only plains and rivers, but also the high landscapes of the Ice Age world. Mountains rise as barriers in the Ice Age world, yet humans learn to cross them. Valleys carved by glaciers and passes swept clear by wind create narrow corridors through which movement and exchange become possible. In regions such as the Alps, the Caucasus, and the Tasda, Tian Shan archaeological evidence shows that people ventured repeatedly into upland environments carrying materials across divides that might otherwise separate cultural worlds. These journeys required skill, and timing for high elevations were dangerous in cold climates. Still, the rewards included access to stone metals, salt, and routes that linked distant valleys. Mountain passes thus became hidden routes within the larger network of Ice Age exchange. Evidence for such crossings appears in the distribution of stone. Flint and chert from highland sources are found in lowland camps, often many days' walk away. In the Pyrenees, tools fashioned from flint outcrops appear in valleys far to the north, suggesting repeated crossings of rugged terrain. In the Caucasus, obsidian sources, high in volcanic ridges, supplied valleys on both sides of the mountains, their products reaching caves in Georgia and Armenia. These materials did not travel randomly. They followed paths that humans mapped onto the ridgelines and passes embedding the mountains into the web of connectivity. A lesser-known detail comes from the Italian Alps, where sites such as Riparo Tagliente contain evidence of obsidian and ochre transported across high passes during the late glacial period. These finds, though modest, suggest that groups living in the lowlands ventured upward to cross the mountains even before permanent glaciers fully retreated. Such crossings would have been arduous, demanding knowledge of snowfields, avalanches, and seasonal timing. Yet they were undertaken demonstrating that barriers could be transformed into conduits when material needs or social ties required. Mystery remains in how frequent and deliberate these crossings were. Did people use mountain passes only occasionally in response to scarcity or unusual gatherings? Or did regular seasonal circuits carry groups back and forth across elevations? Archaeological traces are patchy, often preserved only in caves or rock shelters. Some scholars argue that valleys served more as refuges than as transit routes, while others see persistent signs of transmontane contact. The limited evidence leaves the question unresolved, but the presence of exotic materials on both sides of ranges indicates at least periodic crossings. On the planetary scale, mountains served as climatic frontiers. Glacial ice accumulated in cirques and valleys, while winds funneled through gaps to shape weather on both sides. For humans, these frontiers demanded adaptation. Heavy clothing shelters, built from stone and hide, and fires maintained in treeless terrain. Yet, the very glaciers that posed challenges also supplied meltwater carving river valleys that drew humans upward. These passes became ecological seams where steppe forest and alpine meadow met, providing diverse resources along narrow bands. Their scale is immense. The Caucasus Range stretches more than 100 kilometers, a barrier as broad as the Alps and as high as any in Eurasia. To cross it without roads or domesticated animals required effort comparable to a journey from Berlin to Rome, compressed into the vertical relief of snow and rocky. Yet, artifacts show that such journeys occurred, leaving traces of contact that bind the North and South Caucasus into a single archaeological sphere. A lesser-known observation arises from the mineral resources of mountain zones. Salt deposits in particular drew repeated attention. Even during the Paleolithic, evidence from Central Europe indicates that saline springs were known and visited, their outputs exchanged across valleys. Salt, essential for preservation and diet, may have motivated crossings just as strongly as stone. The presence of salt-related sites near mountain passes reinforces the idea that upland corridors were not only transit routes, but destinations in themselves. Another unresolved question is whether highland crossings were primarily practical or symbolic. Did people journey upward to obtain materials, or did they also seek sacred landscapes in the high places? Some rock art in alpine zones suggests ritual activity. Though dating is difficult, the persistence of symbolic use of high places in later prehistory hints at deep roots. But Ice Age evidence is fragmentary. Whether mountains were merely crossed or also revered remains uncertain. On a planetary scale, the role of mountains in Ice Age networks illustrates how humans adapted to the most challenging environments. They did not avoid these zones, but integrated them into their movements, creating hidden routes that linked broader plains. Passes allowed obsidian from volcanic uplands to reach steppe hunters, ochre from ridges to reach cave painters, and shells from coasts to reach inland valleys. Each crossing added another strand to the fabric of connectivity, showing that distance and difficulty did not prevent exchange. A subtle scale reference highlights this pattern. In the Alps, a pass crossing might involve a climb of 1,500 meters and a journey of 30 kilometers through snow and rock. For a group carrying hides ivory or stone, this meant multiple days of sustained effort. Yet the archaeological record shows that such crossings happened repeatedly enough for exotic materials to become familiar. This persistence underscores the determination of humans to link worlds otherwise separated by elevation. A lesser-known example lies in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where caves such as Denisova preserve evidence of multiple hominin groups. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans interacting across glacial valleys. Though earlier than the last glacial maximum, this record demonstrates the deep antiquity of mountain crossings as zones of contact. Later, during the Ice Age, modern humans continued to use these valleys, carrying materials and genes across the highlands. Mystery lingers in the routes themselves. Few Ice Age paths survive, erased by erosion and glaciers. Yet reconstructions based on artifact distributions suggest that some passes were used for millennia, maintaining corridors across elevations that today remain rugged and remote. The durability of such routes, invisible to the eye, yet etched into the movement of materials, marks them as hidden highways of prehistory. On the planetary scale, mountains highlight how humans were not confined by barriers, but continually tested and extended their range. In doing so, they wove mountain corridors into the first global networks, ensuring that no single landscape stood apart. Exchange stretched from tundra to steppe, from valley to ridge, from coast to upland. As this section closes, one can picture groups moving slowly upward through cold passes, carrying ivory beads, obsidian nodules, and shells strung on sinew. They follow trails known to their elders, crossing snow fields where only stone and wind endure, and they descend into new valleys where other groups wait. The hidden roots of the Ice Age, though silent, now remain embedded in the archaeological record, their traces scattered across caves and terraces. In the next section, the focus turns to saltstone and survival materials, so essential that they magnetized human movement, shaping the rhythms of exchange across continents. Salt and stone form twin anchors of Ice Age survival. Where stone provides the sharp edges for hunting, scraping, and cutting, salt provides the means to sustain life itself, balancing diets and preserving food when resources are scarce. In a glacial world, both materials draw people repeatedly to certain places, creating nodes of activity where exchange flourishes. Archaeological traces show that groups returned again and again to salt springs quarries and outcrops, embedding these sites within broader networks of contact. They became magnets of movement, pulling humans toward them and then radiating their materials outward into distant camps. Stone is visible everywhere in the archaeological record, but salt leaves subtler traces. Springs in Central Europe, such as those later exploited at Hallstatt, likely attracted humans long before the Bronze Age. Pleistocene sediments preserve faunal assemblages, suggesting that both animals and humans frequented saline seeps drawn by the same mineral need. While direct evidence of Ice Age salt processing is scarce, ethnographic and ecological analogies make it plausible that groups recognized and valued these sources. Salt-rich soils and marshes would have been important gathering spots where animals licked the ground and hunters watched. In such places, exchange could occur hides or ivory for saltstone for meat. A lesser-known detail emerges from Upper Paleolithic sites near the Carpathians, where concentrations of faunal remains cluster around known saline springs. Though not definitive, this pattern hints at repeated seasonal use linking salt to survival strategies that also created opportunities for contact. Stone, by contrast, leaves abundant evidence. Flint mines and quarries appear across Ice Age Europe, some modest exposures, others large enough to supply entire regions. At Krzemionki in Poland, Although systematic mining dates later, evidence of Paleolithic use exists in nearby exposures, suggesting that certain flint beds were known for generations. In France, Bergeracois flint traveled over 200 kilometers, appearing in sites distant from its origin. These transfers demonstrate how quarries became central places within human networks. Mystery surrounds the balance between direct procurement and indirect exchange. Did groups travel to salt springs and quarries themselves, or did they rely on intermediaries? Archaeological patterns are ambiguous. Some sites contain large quantities of exotic stone, implying direct visits to the source. Others show scattered pieces, suggesting down-the-line movement. The same uncertainty applies to salt. It may have been carried as chunks of mineral, as brine-soaked hides, or simply as knowledge of where to find it. These mysteries remain unresolved, leaving open the question of how organized Ice Age exchange truly was. On the planetary scale, the importance of salt and stone reflects broader environmental conditions. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels fell and climates dried, salt flats expanded in many regions, creating new sources. Wind-blown loess soils preserved minerals, while glacial grinding exposed fresh stone outcrops. Earth itself provided resources that structured human movement, shaping the pathways along which exchange occurred. The scale of these journeys was considerable. Carrying flint nodules, weighing several kilograms for distances of more than 100 kilometers, required effort and planning. Yet archaeological evidence shows it happened routinely. A subtle scale reference makes the point clear. Flint from southern Britain appears across Doggerland in continental Europe, a journey greater than the span from London to Brussels. Such transfers demonstrate not casual wandering, but sustained connectivity across glacial landscapes. A lesser-known observation is that some stone types, though functional, also carried aesthetic value. Amber-colored flints from Poland, banded cherts from Italy, and glossy obsidians from Anatolia may have appealed as much to appearance as to sharpness. Their circulation suggests that choice and preference played roles alongside necessity. In this sense, stone was both utilitarian and symbolic, much like shell or ivory. Another unresolved question concerns whether salt was exchanged as deliberately as stone. Unlike stone, which endures in the record, salt dissolves and leaves little trace. Yet the clustering of camps near saline environments hints that groups recognized its value, especially when diets were heavy in lean meat. Archaeologists debate whether salt scarcity limited human expansion into some regions or whether natural sources sufficed through opportunistic gathering. The lack of direct evidence keeps the question open. On the planetary scale, salt and stone reveal how humans mapped their world. These materials dictated where people returned, where they lingered, and where they met others. Springs in valleys, quarries on ridges, and gravel beds along rivers formed landmarks in a mental geography of survival and exchange. They became predictable nodes in an otherwise shifting landscape of ice and climate. Over generations, knowledge of these places was passed down, ensuring continuity even as glaciers advanced or retreated. Another lesser-known example illustrates this pattern. In Siberia, archaeological sites near the Angara River contain distinctive stone from sources more than 150 kilometers away, as well as evidence of repeated use of river terraces near mineral-rich zones. These concentrations suggest that groups oriented their movements not just around herds, but around places where stone and salt converged, creating centers of attraction in an otherwise vast steppe. Mystery remains in the social dimension of these materials. Did possession of exotic stone or access to salt enhance prestige? Did groups control access to quarries or springs? Evidence of conflict is scarce, yet the repeated clustering of sites suggests that certain locales had enduring significance, possibly regulated by custom or alliance. Without texts, these social mechanisms remain hidden, leaving archaeologists to infer from patterns of distribution. On the planetary scale, the circulation of salt and stone mirrors the global redistribution of climate and sea. As glaciers advanced, shelves exposed, and rivers lengthened, humans responded by mapping resources and carrying them across landscapes. This process wove together distant communities into networks that extended across continents. In the archaeological record, every exotic flint flake and every cluster of bones near a saline spring testifies to these links. As this section closes, one can imagine a camp set along a valley where a salt spring bubbles near the river. Hunters return with hides and meet tool makers, with nodules of flint carvers, with ivory. Around the hearth, materials from multiple landscapes converge, each carrying its own journey. Salt and stone, essential yet mobile, become the foundation of Ice Age trade. In the next section, the focus turns to the edges of glaciers themselves, where seasonal gatherings at ice margins created unique opportunities for contact exchange and the sharing of knowledge across bands that lived in a world of shifting cold. At the margins of the great ice sheets, humans found both challenge and opportunity. These frozen frontiers where the vast Laurentide, Fennoscandian, and Siberian glaciers met open landscapes were zones of abundance during the short summers. Meltwater carved rivers, wetlands formed along ice edges, and animals gathered in large numbers to graze on new vegetation. For people, these margins became seasonal destinations, places where resources could be harvested predictably and where groups who lived apart for most of the year might converge. The edges of glaciers, though harsh, functioned as social landscapes, drawing communities together for exchange and communication. Archaeological evidence for such gatherings comes from sites like Kostenki on the Don River, where dozens of settlements cluster along terraces near glacial rivers. Here, mammoth bone dwellings, hearths, and ornaments suggest repeated seasonal use, possibly involving groups larger than the family units that moved across the steppe. The density of sites implies gatherings where materials were exchanged, marriages arranged, and information shared. Similar patterns appear at Pavlov and Dolny Vestonitz in the Czech Republic, where elaborate burials, figurines, and ornaments signal communities converging in larger numbers than usual. A lesser-known detail is the discovery of clay figurines at Dolny Vestonit, fired in kilns tens of thousands of years before ceramics became common. These fragile figures, produced at a site near the glacial frontier, suggest that symbolic experimentation flourished where people gathered in numbers, reflecting both practical exchange and cultural creativity. Yet mysteries remain. Did these seasonal gatherings follow predictable schedules, perhaps tied to the migration of reindeer or mammoth? Or were they opportunistic, shaped by the year's climate and animal patterns? Archaeologists debate whether sites like Dolny Vestonitz represent annual aggregation camps or more episodic events. The limited time depth of occupation layers makes it difficult to resolve. Still, the repeated return to the same valleys suggests enduring traditions of meeting at the ice edge. On the planetary scale, glacier margins were dynamic boundaries. As ice advanced or retreated, rivers shifted, valleys opened or closed, and ecosystems reorganized. Humans tracked these changes, following animals and water into new zones. The seasonal pulse of meltwater also affected broader climates, influencing winds and rainfall far beyond the ice. Thus, the gatherings at glacier margins were not isolated local events, but part of larger systems shaped by global ice dynamics. The scale of movement involved could be immense. Groups traveling from steppe zones to glacial valleys might cover hundreds of kilometers journeys, comparable to walking from Paris to Munich. Such distances, repeated annually or across generations, ensured that ideas, tools, and ornaments circulated widely. A subtle scale reference underscores this. Ivory ornaments found at Dolny Vestonitz originated from mammoth hunting grounds more than 200 kilometers away, demonstrating that materials converged from multiple landscapes into single sites of gathering. A lesser-known observation concerns the role of fire. At glacial margins, driftwood and brush were scarce, yet hearths are abundant in archaeological layers. This suggests careful collection and perhaps exchange of fuel resources, or the use of bone as fuel, a practice confirmed at several Upper Paleolithic sites. The reliance on bone fuel highlights how humans adapted to the resource constraints of glacial environments while maintaining the centrality of fire in social and symbolic life. Another unresolved question is the social scale of these gatherings. Were they large festivals involving dozens of groups or modest meetings between neighboring bands? The archaeological record offers only indirect clues: dense site clusters. Rich symbolic artifacts and evidence of diverse materials imply more than local activity. Yet without precise population counts, the true scale remains uncertain. On the planetary scale, the ice edge gatherings mirror similar processes elsewhere. In North America, early sites along the margins of the Laurentide ice sheet suggest that people adapted to advancing and retreating fronts, using meltwater corridors to spread southward and eastward. In Siberia, valleys near glacial limits hosted repeated occupations as seen at Yana, RHS, where humans lived within sight of ice even 32,000 years ago. These examples emphasize that glacier margins were not barriers, but focal points of human adaptation and interaction. Another lesser-known case lies in the use of colored pigments at glacial edge sites. At Pavlov, not only red ochre, but also graphite was used, suggesting experimentation with multiple pigments. This variety may reflect exchange between groups who encountered different geological sources, reinforcing the idea that glacier margins served as crossroads of material and cultural diversity. Mystery persists about how information traveled at these gatherings. Did groups share hunting knowledge, tool-making techniques, or symbolic traditions? The spread of Gravettian culture across much of Europe during this time suggests that gatherings played a role in transmitting shared practices. Yet the exact mechanisms, whether through intermarriage, apprenticeship, or ritual, remain elusive. Still, the persistence of stylistic patterns across vast distances implies sustained contact facilitated by periodic aggregation. On the planetary scale, these seasonal nodes represent an early form of social networking. Just as rivers, coasts, and steppes carried materials, glacier margins created predictable rendezvous points where multiple threads of the network converged. Here, ideas and materials could spread quickly, radiating outward as groups dispersed again into their territories. The gatherings thus acted as amplifiers of exchange, magnifying the circulation of symbols and resources across continents. Another lesser-known observation is that some burials at these sites include individuals with elaborate ornaments, such as the double burial at Sungir in Russia, where children were interred with thousands of ivory beads. Such investment of labor implies not only symbolic depth, but also the presence of large cooperative groups capable of producing and assembling such wealth. These burials reinforce the idea that aggregation sites supported complex social interactions transcending mere subsistence. As this section closes, one can picture the edge of a glacier, its front gleaming in summer sun, meltwater feeding braided streams, herds grazing nearby and smoke rising from clustered hearths. Groups gather, exchange ivory beads, flint blades, shells, and ochre, and then disperse again across the plains. The ice looms as a wall, yet at its margin human networks thrive, stitching together the fractured landscapes of the Ice Age. In the next section, attention shifts from land to sea, exploring how lowered oceans exposed vast shelves and coasts, enabling humans to cross frozen or shallow waters and extend their networks into new realms of contact. When sea levels fell more than 120 meters during the height of the last glacial maximum, vast tracts of the continental shelf were exposed. Coastlines stretched outward, and shallow straits narrowed or vanished, creating land bridges and frozen passages that humans could traverse. These new landscapes expanded the range of human movement and exchange, connecting continents and islands that are now divided by seas. Archaeological and geological evidence together reveal that these exposed shelves were not barren wastelands, but fertile zones of rivers, wetlands, and plains where humans lived, hunted, and met. Their submergence after the Ice Age explains why so much of this history remains hidden beneath modern oceans. One of the most significant regions was Beringia, a broad landmass linking Siberia and Alaska. At its greatest extent, it spanned nearly 1,500 kilometers from north to south, supporting tundra steppe ecosystems rich in bison, mammoth, and horse. Archaeological traces are sparse because later seas drowned much of the shelf. Yet inland sites show that people thrived there as early as 32,000 years ago. Beringia was not simply a bridge. It was a homeland with rivers, lakes, and valleys that sustained life for millennia. Materials such as stone and ivory circulated across this zone, and genetic evidence confirms that human groups maintained connections across the landmass. A lesser-known detail is that the shorelines of Beringia hosted brackish marshes and fisheries providing protein sources that supplemented terrestrial hunting. The presence of fish bones and waterfowl remains in inland sites suggests that humans exploited these resources, though their camps now lie beneath the modern Bering Strait. Across Eurasia, similar shelves exposed new corridors. Doggerland in the North Sea, a low-lying plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, carried rivers that merged into great estuaries. Flint tools and bones recovered by dredgers testify that people lived and hunted there. The Thames, Rhine, and Meuse joined into a single river system flowing across what is now seabed. For humans of the time, this plain was simply another hunting ground linking groups from both sides of the channel. Its later drowning erased much of the record, yet stray finds reveal its significance. On the planetary scale, these shelves represent one of the most dramatic transformations of Earth's surface during the Ice Age. As ice locked up water, oceans retreated, exposing nearly 27 million square kilometers of new land worldwide. This reshaped migration routes and created environments where trade networks could extend into regions otherwise cut off. The global map of the time was unfamiliar. Sahul united Australia with New Guinea and Tasmania. Sundaland joined mainland Southeast Asia with Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, and the Persian Gulf was a river valley feeding wetlands. Humans moved through these expanded landscapes carrying shells, stone, and pigments far beyond their original contexts. Mystery surrounds the mechanics of sea crossings during this time. Some straits never fully closed, such as those between Sunda and Sahul. Did humans cross them on rafts or skin boats, or did they wait for seasonal ice to form? Archaeological evidence is limited, yet the presence of humans in Sahul more than 60,000 years ago proves that seafaring, however rudimentary, occurred long before the last glacial maximum. Later lowered seas would have made such crossings shorter and easier, enhancing exchange networks across archipelagos. A subtle scale reference underscores the distances involved. The landmass of Doggerland alone covered an area larger than modern Britain, and Beringia equaled the size of modern India. Crossing them was not a matter of a single journey, but of inhabiting vast landscapes, moving seasonally, and carrying goods across hundreds of kilometers. For people accustomed to walking the steppe, these shelves were simply continuations of the world, new corridors for contact and survival. A lesser-known observation is that some of the earliest known shell ornaments in Southeast Asia likely came from coastlines that are now submerged. Their inland presence suggests that exchange extended across Sundaland, linking river valleys to distant shores. The flooding of these shelves after the Ice Age erased entire chapters of human prehistory, leaving only scattered artifacts in caves and highland sites as evidence of once thriving coastal networks. Another unresolved question is how long humans occupied these shelves before rising seas forced retreat. Geological reconstructions suggest that Doggerland remained habitable until about 8,000 years ago, while parts of Sundaland drowned earlier as glaciers melted. Did people return season after season, or did they establish more permanent settlements on these plains? Archaeology is silent, yet the density of material from surrounding uplands suggests sustained use. On the planetary scale, the opening and closing of shelves demonstrates how glacial cycles continually rewrote the geography of contact. Networks expanded when seas fell and contracted when waters rose. Yet, the practices established during low sea phases, meeting, exchanging, carrying ornaments and tools, persisted later, adapting to flooded coastlines and smaller islands. These habits formed the cultural backbone of human exchange long before agriculture. Another lesser-known example lies in the Persian Gulf basin, which during the Ice Age was a fertile plain crisscrossed by rivers. Archaeologists suggest that this zone may have been a refugium hosting populations who later spread along its reflooded shores. If so, then some of the earliest long-distance exchanges between Mesopotamia, Iran, and Arabia may have originated in a landscape now hidden beneath the sea. Mystery lingers in the archaeological silence of these drowned lands. We know from genetics that populations spread through them, and from geology that rivers and wetlands flourished there. Yet without systematic underwater archaeology, the details remain unknown. Each artifact, dredged from the North Sea or the Persian Gulf, is a reminder of vast lost worlds, where networks of trade and contact once thrived. On the planetary scale, these submerged corridors highlight the fragility of human evidence against the immensity of climate change. The rise and fall of seas determined which networks endured in the archaeological record and which vanished. Still, the persistence of shells inland, of flints across shelves, and of genetic signals across continents proves that humans bridged these lost lands. As this section closes, one can picture a wide plain where rivers flow across what is now ocean camps set along terraces. Mammoths grazing in summer grass and people stringing shells carried from distant coasts. Their world was larger than ours, a world where oceans retreated and connections multiplied. In the next section, attention shifts from material traces to genetic ones as ancient DNA reveals the deep interconnections between populations, confirming that Ice Age exchange was not only about goods, but also about people themselves. Long before cities, markets, or writing humans already participated in exchanges that spanned continents. The Ice Age networks of stone shell ochre, ivory, and genes reveal that trade in its earliest form was not an invention of agriculture or civilization, but a persistent feature of human life. These exchanges were not organized economies, but overlapping webs of reciprocity, gifting, and movement that carried materials and ideas farther than any one group could travel. They show that even in small bands of foragers, the impulse to connect, to share, and to carry symbols of distant places was deeply ingrained. Archaeological finds illustrate this continuity. In Central Europe, burials at Sungir with thousands of ivory beads represent not only artistry, but also the labor of entire communities, suggesting cooperation and exchange on a scale beyond immediate households. In North Africa, shell beads carried far inland testify to contact between desert dwellers and coastal groups. In Siberia, obsidian and ivory ornaments appear in camps hundreds of kilometers from their sources. Each example confirms that humans valued objects not simply for survival, but for their ability to bind groups together. A lesser-known detail is that some of the earliest woven fibers discovered impressions preserved in fired clay at Dolny Vestonice show that threads and cords were already part of Ice Age technology. Though fragile, these fibers may have been used to string beads, tie ornaments, or bind materials in bundles for exchange. Their presence suggests that networks were supported by technologies that facilitated the transport and display of symbolic goods. Mystery persists about the motivations behind these exchanges. Were they driven by practical necessity, by the need for better stone or salt, or were they fueled by social and symbolic imperatives? The desire to maintain alliances and express shared identity. Archaeologists cannot fully separate utility from meaning. The same bead might serve both as decoration and as evidence of distant connection. The persistence of exchange across millennia suggests that both motives were intertwined. On the planetary scale, these networks prefigure the global systems of later history. Just as rivers, seas, and roads would later bind empires, Ice Age rivers, shelves, and steppes bound forager bands. The difference lies in scale and structure. No central authority coordinated these exchanges, yet their cumulative effect was to link continents indirectly. From Beringia to Sahul, from Iberia to Siberia, materials and genes moved in webs that foreshadowed later trade routes like the Silk Road. The continuity of human connectivity across glacial time shows that globalization has roots deep in prehistory. A subtle scale reference helps to illustrate this continuity. The distance from the Red Sea coast, where shells were gathered, to the inland deserts where they were found equals more than 200 kilometers a journey across arid landscapes that required planning and knowledge of water sources. The persistence of shells in inland contexts suggests not chance, but deliberate transport embedding networks in the rhythm of seasonal movement. A lesser-known observation is that genetic evidence from Ice Age populations in Europe reveals repeated turnovers as new groups replaced or merged with old ones. Yet the material culture, such as ornaments and tool types, often remained continuous across these shifts. This suggests that exchange networks